Europe and the planet the day after tomorrow. We will do two exciting talks. The first one by Isabel Estevez about green industrial policy, power and democracy, followed by Andreas Malm, who will join us by a video call about overshoot and democracy. Will they mix?
Very much. And thanks so much to the Remarque Institute for the invitation and for curating this exciting event. I also want to say I really appreciate Remarque for taking the initiative to kind of break us out of our silos. I myself often feel very siloed in my own work, kind of jumping from academic to political spaces and without having a chance to zoom out and look at the whole. So I'm very happy to have a chance to do that today. And what I'll share today are some reflections about what I think is the significance and the stakes of this industrial policy moment that we're going through in the US right now, drawing in part from my experiences of the past half decade, both in the academic and think tank space, but also wading through some of the concrete power dynamics and the policy details of US industrial policy. As I worked with a broad coalition of environmental, labor, and civil society organizations trying to shape the Inflation Reduction Act into something that could possibly resemble a Green New Deal. And as you all know, which we very much did not succeed in that endeavor, the IRA is very far from a Green New Deal. But what I want to share are some lessons from that fight, as well as some opportunities that I see for using the money and the momentum in the IRA to shape all of that into something constructive that can get us a bit closer to the kind of economy and society that I think we all in this room want to see. And I'll emphasize three key points. The first has to do with the bittersweet nature of the emergent industrial policy moment in the US. We all know that the IRA and the policies that were discussed earlier are very far from perfect, and they were achieved as well at the cost of very active harms to community that will stem from concessions to fossil fuel capital and emerging green capital. But at the same time, the policies are historic, they are monumental in their proportions, and they hold a lot of potential to tackle some of our greatest societal challenges, from climate change to toxic pollution, to deindustrialization, economic decline, and inequality. And they hold the potential to build a power base for long-term socioeconomic progress toward an economy that better serves human and natural flourishing. The second point that I'll make is that for many people, it has proven very tempting to conflate the return of industrial policy with the rejection of neoliberalism and its ills. But in fact, industrial policy in and of itself is neither good nor bad. And whether industrial policies yield progressive or aggressive results depends on how democratically rooted they are, on how well they respond and serve the interests of the many above the few, and especially those who most lack the basic necessities to thrive. So if industrial policies are undemocratically designed and implemented, they're bound to reinforce existing power asymmetries and distributional inequities and human and environmental harms. On the contrary, if they're democratically designed and implemented, they may likely do the opposite. And the third point I want to highlight is that it will come down to civil society, from social movements to academia to everyday citizens, to determine the shape and the outcomes of today's green industrial policy. Governments, I think as we started to discuss earlier, are not homogeneous. They're not homogeneous in their political orientation, nor are they omnipotent. And many of the functions that I think we wish benevolent elements within the government to play to curb abuse by concentrations of power and make transformative change are often beyond their capabilities and beyond institutional constraints. I think that means that civil society will increasingly have to fulfill parasitic functions to actively blur the boundaries between state and private society, not just to hold governments accountable, but also to become economic agents, to design and to execute economic planning that's rooted in popular demands. I'll attack that later. But let's begin with the first point, the bittersweet nature of the emergent US industrial policy. I think to begin with, it's worth highlighting that if we want to characterize US industrial policy in this moment in broad strokes, which is something I'm generally reluctant to do because of its heterogeneity and its emergent nature, I would argue that today's US industrial policy is probably best understood more or less as a continuation policies that have been in place for decades to centuries, going back to Alexander Hamilton. In its early years, the core purpose of industrial policy in the US was the same purpose that guides any dependent nation: secure economic independence through development of strong technological and productive capabilities. But later, as the US climbed the development ladder, the goal of economic independence evolved or transformed into a goal of economic and military dominance. And until today, the core of industrial policy capabilities reside in the military-industrial complex, a nexus that even Eisenhower warned about due to its impacts on democracy and the misplacement of power. But the more specific missions that guide US industrial policy have varied throughout history. And today, with the advent of the IRA and the CHIPS Act, bipartisan infrastructure law, I think what we're seeing is an industrial policy that's deeply intertwined with a move away from a long period of relative austerity that marked neoliberalism in the US. a moment that's primarily about the revival of public investment centered on the development and transformation of certain strategic industries. That includes industries like renewables, not just because or even primarily because of their relevance for climate goals, but because they're seen as strategic to the US goal of economic security and to preserving its dominant role in the global economy. And there are, I believe, at least three salient components of a general goal of economic security. One is to build US competitiveness and some level of self-reliance at the technological frontier, products like semiconductors and green technologies that are considered to have a bright future in the global export market, and in some of which, like solar, the US is lagging far behind China. Second goal is about restoring and protecting some level of productive capabilities in the heavy industry sector, especially in steel and aluminum. And that's in part a strategy of modernization to better compete with Europe, which is leading the way in heavy industry decarbonization. And it's also in part a strategy to revitalize those industries in places that have suffered from deindustrialization and ensuing economic and social decline, which we're seeing now are also fueling authoritarian drift. And a third economic security goal has to do with energy diversification, which consists in, first of all, continuing to heavily subsidize the fossil fuel industry, while at the same time developing new renewable energy sectors. And again, betting on the growth of the market for green technologies worldwide. So all of these economic security motivations seem more or less to continue to dominate US industrial policy, sometimes in harmony with, and sometimes in direct conflict with, other social and environmental goals like reducing inequality, reducing pollution, curbing biodiversity loss, or improving conditions for workers. I think it's also worth noting here that, since we are here to talk about democracy, that one of the challenges for making industrial policy cohere with social and environmental goals is actually embedded in the very statutory nature of the Inflation Reduction Act. As some of you may know, when the Democratic Party gained control of the House and Senate in 2018, they made a choice not to abolish the filibuster, which meant that they did not have sufficient votes to pass the Inflation Reduction Act through conventional legislative processes, and they were instead compelled to negotiate the Inflation Reduction Act through a mechanism called budget reconciliation, which made it difficult to impossible to attach labor standards or environmental or equity standards to any of those investments in a way that could shape concrete projects in line with goals like equitable economic transformation. And I'm happy to discuss later if there's interest, what we progressive coalitions did and are doing to mitigate that lack of standards and what advocates are doing now to achieve some level of oversight and accountability in the implementation phase of the IRA. But an even more bitter side of the IRA has to do with the new sacrifice zones that it has created as part of the deal struck with Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia to secure his deciding vote. That included major concessions to the natural gas industry, like the construction of the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which is going to directly harm poor Black, white, Indigenous frontline communities across Virginia, West Virginia, and North Carolina. And beyond that, the IRA also contains features that directly benefit the fossil fuel industry, like funding for blue hydrogen production, which uses natural gas as an input and traps carbon emissions with carbon capture and storage, which is a technology that's been opposed by many communities because of its environmental and health impacts. So that's the bitter reality of the IRA, and that's without touching the matter of everything that was gutted from the original Build Back Better package that the Biden administration proposed, including enormous care economy investments that were completely cut out. But there is, of course, also a sweeter side to the IRA, namely the historic amounts of new public money that it's created, money that, if well used, can fuel a green transition, and money that we should remember was also partly an income transfer from capital. The IRA was paid for in part by increasing corporate taxation and by a tax on share buybacks, as well as increased tax information for high income earners. But still, given the bitter sides of the IRA, and speaking as someone who was in the fight for a much more ambitious package in line with the Green New Deal, my feelings about the IRA are very bittersweet. And part of that ambivalence also stems from the fact that there are still way too many known unknowns about the IRA's impacts. For one, there has yet to be enough transparency to assess the implications of many funded projects. And just as importantly, much of the funding has yet to be awarded and most projects have not been built. That brings me to my second point, which is that the way that these funds that have been unlocked by the IRA will reshape our economy is still largely up in the air. And there are contentious battles playing out to determine how and by whom that money will be used. Fights that are happening both outside and also very much inside the state apparatus. And something that, as I said before, is not sufficiently acknowledged in the public discourse about industrial policy is that governments they're really not monoliths, they're heterogeneous, and the political economy inside the state apparatus is very contentious. That means that every day there are different factions within the government trying to define the details that make the difference between money flowing to projects that bring us closer to a new economy, or money flowing to projects that simply reinforce existing past dependencies and inequities and power asymmetries. And some of the actors While some of the actors may want to use industrial policy strictly for economic security objectives, even at the expense of human well-being, that doesn't mean that's the only vision inside the state, and it doesn't mean that's a vision that will prevail necessarily. The vision that does prevail inside government and struggle to shape the direction of industrial policy is going to be determined in part by power dynamics outside the state apparatus. Different actors with different coalitions behind them are currently vying to claim public money to define the nature of the strings attached to grants and loans and tax credits, and to determine the level of oversight and accountability to which they're subject. So whether the money flows to natural gas reliant companies with poor labor standards, or to the companies using the greenest available technologies and high labor standards and equitable community benefit agreements, will also depend on how well different coalitions build power and how well they play their cards. To give you just one example from the steel industry, in March of this year, the Department of Energy announced the recipients of $6 billion in IRA grants for heavy industry decarbonization. And one of the awardees, the steel giant Cleveland-Cliffs, was selected to receive up to $575 million in public funds to make somewhat cleaner, but not the cleanest possible steel, while at the same time announcing $600 million in share buybacks. And all of this in the context of historic levels of liquidity for the company of $4.5 billion. But all of this is tentative. Negotiations, including for this particular contract, are still happening and still quite contentious. And what that means is that as the Department of Energy moves forward in negotiations, it has the chance to make the company shift that $500 million from share buybacks toward more investments in decarbonization. It could make the difference between the company building a somewhat cleaner facility or a cutting edge facility that slashes pollution as much as today's technologies allows. And it could make the difference between replacing one or several coal-based facilities with greener alternatives, which in turn would make the difference between continuing to poison fence-line communities with cancer-causing lead and other pollutants, or ensuring their access to clean air and water. It could also make the difference between allowing some old and polluting steel facilities to simply decline into retirement, putting thousands out of work, or ensuring their long-term viability by modernizing them and bringing them to the green technological frontier. And if that company is not willing to use its liquidity in that way, the federal, state, or local government could explore options for creating new public green steel companies. As we know, steel is publicly managed in many countries because of its strategic significance. And in fact, of the steel facilities selected by the Department of Energy, the most environmentally ambitious is a state-owned company, but not an American state-owned company. It's a Swedish state-owned company that's investing in the US. And if the government does not want to create state-owned companies, workers can also create new companies capable of receiving public funds. So we have options. However, none of that will happen if there isn't active leadership, engagement, and initiative and oversight from civil society to push policymakers in that direction. And also to support policymakers who may already share a similar vision but have no external coalition backing them and pushing them to counterbalance the weight of corporate power in favor of the public interest. And that brings me to my final point, which is about the special role and the power of civil society in this juncture. And since this is mostly an academic space, I'll focus on the role of academia and researchers. In the past couple of years, working at a think tank, just one step removed from the world of advocacy where I sat before, I found it very difficult to understand what kind of research was most useful and most strategic for real world change. And when I was in academia, even further removed from the kind of fast moving political realities, it was almost impossible to know what was useful. But I think in a moment like today, which I would argue is a critical conjuncture because of the liminal nature of much of US industrial strategy, I think it's imperative for those of us in the trade of researching and writing to think very carefully about the kind of work that's worth our time. And there are many right answers here, but as I alluded to in the beginning, I have found that it's one of the most important things we can do right now is to do work that serves a purpose of oversight and of filling gaps in the industrial policy state apparatus. In other words, fulfilling parastate functions. And that can be as simple as making case studies that help advocates to better understand how corporate actors are trying to shape industrial policy so they can hold them to account, or it can be as ambitious as doing research as if we were in the shoes of industrial planners. And I'll give you one example of the latter from a project on solar deployment that we're about to launch next week as a collaboration between researchers at the Roosevelt Institute and the Climate and Community Institute. Part of what our project is trying to do is to help plug some gaps in national planning capabilities, and specifically land use and site planning for solar deployment. We do that by asking the question of where specifically we should be building solar capacity to maximize public benefit and minimize negative impacts on communities and nature. In other words, what are the nationwide high benefit, low harm sites for building solar capacity? So that meant nationwide accounting and mapping of places like brownfields and Superfund sites and rooftops and highways and railways and other infrastructure to identify places where solar will be welcome, accelerating the green transition without harming communities. And we found that there are nearly 226 million acres of high benefit, low harm areas for solar deployment, much more than the 3 to 15 million that's needed to meet solar deployment targets in line with the most ambitious climate targets. So our hope is that those kinds of mapping efforts can help federal, state, and local governments, as well as communities, to engage in their own planning processes to direct solar deployment in ways that are not primarily driven by the profit motive, which is currently motivating corporations to direct investments to greenfield sites and even cutting down forests to build new solar capacity. So that's just one example of one of the ways in which we as researchers can try to serve as more than spectators or critical commentators, but are also as active agents in designing solutions in the future of our economy and through it, the future of our democracy. And no matter how we engage with the ongoing industrial transformation, it's critical to remember that every industrial policy, every effort to influence what goods and services we make and how we make them, doesn't just affect which industries survive and thrive and which decline. Every industrial policy is also an environmental policy. It's also a distributional policy, a natural resources policy, and a labor policy. Every policy and every project affects existing power relations and distributional outcomes. Who gains and loses access to clean air and water? Who keeps and loses their homes, jobs, and livelihoods? Industrial policy can redistribute, or it can make inequities worse. It can reshape economic geographies to repair past harms, or it can create new geographies that replicate past exercises in racist and exclusionary zoning and gratuitous natural degradation. Industrial policy can create and sustain good jobs and revitalize communities to curb authoritarian drift by bringing people out of a state of economic despair and loneliness and existential fear that fuels bigotry and xenophobia and other forms of hostility and violence that erode democracy. Or it can further erode democracy by eroding the power of workers, harming communities, distrust and despair. So in other words, industrial policy can help build an equitable and sustainable economy, or it can undermine it. And there's a growing sense for those of us that what we do today to shape the industrial transformation underway is not just going to determine what kind of economy emerges from this moment, but also what kind of society.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Overshoot and democracy, will they mix?
All right. First of all, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and we can see you now.
Yes.
Welcome, Andreas.
Yeah. So I want to begin by saying that I'm terribly sorry to interact with you in this remote manner. I had been very much looking forward to being in New York and meeting all of you and talking to you, but I fell terribly ill just before I was going to depart, and it was absolutely impossible for me to travel, and I'm still recovering, so I might be a little bit low on energy. I ask you to bear with me. So what I want to do here is basically just raise a few questions surrounding the relation between democracy and Overshoot. So these remarks will be based on work that I've done recently together with my colleague Wim Carton. We have a book coming out next week called Overshoot: How the World Surrendered to Climate Breakdown. And we have a second volume, a much longer book coming out about a year from now, to be called The Long Heat: Climate Politics When It's Too Late. And the concept of overshoot is central to this project. And by overshoot, you can think of different definitions, but what it means basically is that we are now on the cusp of 1.5 degrees of global warming and rapidly transgressing this limit that was laid down by the Paris Agreement, and probably on the way to breaching the limit of 2 degrees as well on current trajectories. And this gives rise to what we call in these books the overshoot conjuncture, which is a conjuncture where the drivers of global warming are out of control, and the dominant classes have essentially given up on getting them under control, and instead have to manage the consequences, the fallout, by doing something else than mitigation, classically understood as cutting emissions and closing down the sources of the problem. And what can be done in this conjuncture is essentially three things. It's adaptation, so learning to live with this warming. It's carbon dioxide removal, so developing various kinds of negative emissions technologies for drawing the excess of CO2 in the atmosphere down back to the solid Earth. And third, solar geoengineering technologies for blocking incoming sunlight and thereby cooling down the Earth. And on all of these three fronts, technology is absolutely central. So what adaptation, removal, and geoengineering essentially are all about is developing various kinds of technologies for dealing with this global warming that couldn't be stopped before it became too late. And the question I just want to ask is, what are the consequences for democracy and for, to use the term just used, for authoritarian drift, for governance in political science lingo? And I'm just going to very briefly outline some of the problems on these fronts. So if we look at, to begin with, adaptation, we can take as a kind of a paradigmatic case what's been going on in France over the past couple of years. Clémence will know much more about this than I do, and perhaps others who are French in the audience as well, but I'll just say a few words about it. So in France, we've seen a very intense struggle over the past years around water reservoirs or megabassins that are built and advertised as a form of adaptation where large agribusiness companies centralize increasingly scarce water resources in these huge tanks. This has elicited a lot of discontent from small farmers and others who are deprived of this water resource that is centralized in these tanks. And there have been a series of mass actions, mass demonstrations, and sabotage actions against these reservoirs, leading to very serious repression from the French state apparatus against this movement. Most recently this summer, when there was a big a camp in one of the areas where a lot of these reservoirs are being built, that was dealt with by very intrusive and aggressive policing. And the logic that this case brings out, I think, is one where adaptation is supposed to happen through massive technological projects. So we speak about muscular adaptationism as a kind of term for what might be going on here. So the idea that we can manage these problems, such as increasing water scarcity, by rolling out these massive technologies for better dominating or controlling nature, in a sense. And these technologies tend to work a little bit like the megabasin in that they centralize and protect increasingly scarce resources under the domain of private property. And this creates various types of discontent that then has to be policed and repressed in more or less authoritarian fashion. Another kind of emerging frontline for this muscular adaptationism is, I don't know if you've seen these reports about various scientists coming up with the idea that instead of building seawalls and trying to protect coastlines around the world, it's more efficient to actually build the seawalls around the melting polar ice sheets. So the idea being to build huge walls or other kinds of structures in front of the glacier outlets on Greenland and West Antarctica in particular, to block the ice from entering the ocean. This being then imagined as a much more technologically efficient form of adaptation than building a lot of seawalls around all of the coastlines. So you just deal with the problem at the source by going to the poles themselves. Now, if that were to happen, and there are now experiments underway, well, they will start next year in Norwegian fjords. There's this group of scientists, they want to try to build these structures in the Norwegian fjords to see if this works and can then be exported to Greenland and Antarctica. This, of course, raises enormous issues around governance. So if the fates of the shorelines around the world are going to be tied to this particular locations where you have to build these huge engineering projects in Greenland and Antarctica, who is going to do this? What state apparatus is going to move in and coordinate and organize this kind of construction, which is going to be massive, to say the least. If we move on, and I'm going to be very quick here because time is limited, obviously. If we move on to carbon dioxide removal and negative emissions technologies, the field is enormous and developing very rapidly. The classical technology here is BECCS, or bioenergy carbon capture and storage. So the idea that you establish again, enormous. Everything about this is enormous because the scale is so large. The scale of the problem has become so big. So if you're going to have to deal, if you're going to deal with the outcome, the scale also has to be enormous. So the idea being, to repeat myself again, enormous plantations of fast growing tree species that rapidly capture CO2 through photosynthesis, and then you harvest these trees and you burn them as biomass in a power plant, and you capture the CO2 through a filter, a classical CCS filter, essentially. And you get a pure stream of CO2 that you inject into the ground. And if you keep doing this as a loop, you have a pump that draws down CO2 into the lithosphere, so back into the underground. The problem with this technology, well, first we should say that this technology is at the core of the very concept and conjuncture of Overshoot, because when the 1.5 degree target was solidified in climate science and politics, it became premised on the idea that we're going to probably miss the target of 1.5 degrees, but then we can later hit it by rolling out BECCS plantations towards the end of this century and suck the CO2 back to Earth. But this technology, when it entered the models and the IPCC scenarios to shoulder this burden of removing excess CO2 towards the end of the century, was a fictional technology. It didn't exist, and it still doesn't exist at scale. There are now a couple of projects, BECCS projects, that are being developed, including here in Sweden. But it's been well known for some time that if we're actually going to do BECCS on the scale where it can draw down CO2 of anything like the extent imagined, you would need something like the equivalent of total current cropland on Earth for these plantations, which again raises quite significant problems concerning democracy and power relations. So where will the land be for these plantations? What people will have to give up their land? What people might have to stop eating the way they have used to eat up until now to convert land into these plantations? And of course, all the models converge on the tropics as the location where these plantations will somehow materialize. So it's a question of, okay, how are we going to free up land being used in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia for these plantations? And you can just by posing the question like that, you can perhaps see some of the challenges for anything like democracy if we're actually going to do BECCS on anything like this scale. I'm going to skip the other negative emissions technologies for now and instead move on to geoengineering, which is gaining a lot of press these days. I don't know if you've read, for instance, the recent series or the ongoing series in New York Times about solar geoengineering. And we're seeing now a string of experiments in this technology. And these experiments take different forms. So we have two leading startups experimenting now in solar geoengineering in very different forms. One is called Make Sunsets, and it's based in California. And it's essentially two dudes who go to parking lots and send up balloons with sulfate aerosols that they release into the atmosphere, and then they say that we are counteracting global warming by releasing this sulfate into the atmosphere through our balloons, and therefore you can buy cooling credits and finance these balloons. And they do this very publicly. It's a totally transparent PR stunt, and it's very, you know, in the style of some kind of Silicon Valley performativity or whatever. But then there's another startup which operates in a completely different manner. It's called Stardust Solutions, and it's based in the state of Israel. And in February of this year, the Wall Street Journal reported, I'm going to quote the report. This is what it said in the Wall Street Journal. In Israel, a startup called Stardust Solutions has begun testing a system to disperse a cloud of tiny reflective particles about 60,000 feet in altitude. So this is in the stratosphere. Furthermore, they are doing aerial testing of an idea called solar radiation management, also known as stratospheric aerosol injection, by basically flying really high in an airplane, releasing reflective particles. And unlike Make Sunsets, this was done in secrecy, and this startup operates in a very different manner. It is essentially one of these startups that draws its technological prowess from being part of the Israeli military establishments. So it's under the Israeli Defense Forces. And this was then the first experiment in actual airplanes ejecting sulfate aerosols happening in February of this year, while the genocide in Gaza was in full swing. And here you see the technology being rolled out with no kind of democratic oversight or transparency. It's cloaked in secrecy and heavily militarized. There is, of course, for those of you who follow solar geoengineering, the ubiquitous figure of David Keith, who was responsible for a high-profile experiment project based at Harvard University called ScopeX. And this project was supposed to culminate in a trial in Sweden, in Sápmi, so in the Sami territories, in 2021. But protests from the indigenous Sami population and environmental movements stopped this experiment. So it didn't happen, and ScopeX dissolved last year. And David Keith was very upfront in a recent profile of him in New York Times about the lessons drawn from this debacle. And he said that the next time we do something like this, we're not going to be as open about it. So he essentially, because what we did, and we said what we were going to do, and this created a lot of protest. So we couldn't do it, and therefore the next time we make something like this, an experiment like this, we're going to not tell anyone what we're going to do. And Keith himself has made the case that geoengineering, I'm quoting him here directly, geoengineering seems to demand centralized control. End quote. And the rationale for this is pretty clear. If you're going to do geoengineering, it has to be one actor who is in control of deployment. You cannot have a lot of different countries or agents doing geoengineering at the same time, because then there will be total chaos in the atmosphere. And the technology comes with all of these risks of counter geoengineering and conflicts between different agents about what level of sulfate aerosol injection you want to have. So to avoid total anarchy, there has to be one kind of Hobbesian Leviathan in the stratosphere who runs this show. There has to be a deeply centralized control of this technology for it to work at all. And Keith and his colleagues have not shied away from the argument that this requires, I'm quoting here, that the technology be, quote, institutionally insulated from broader debates, or some degree of technocracy will be necessary. You just can't let, you know, the popular masses decide of this technology and tinker with it. It has to be function a little bit like central banks dealing with monetary policy outside of democratic channels. This is an analogy sometimes used. Because democracy and solar geoengineering seem very difficult to combine. Yeah. Again, the logic here being that a large-scale technology for dealing with the fallout from uncontrollable, unmitigated global warming requires such a degree of state intervention that discontent and conflicts that erupt in the wake of this technology have to be brought under some kind of control. And what we're seeing right now, with where we're in the phase of just early experiments, which is obviously something different from deployment. What you can do with these experiments is you can release sulfate particles into the stratosphere, whether through balloons or more reliably through airplanes. And you can see what happens to these particles and follow them, but you don't really know what the technology will actually do to the planet before full deployment, which is something else and is still in the future. But these phases are of course linked, and the ongoing troubles and problems around the experiments with geoengineering kind of prefigure the democratic deficit that seems to inhere in the technology. Because as soon as you go public, this is the lesson from Scopex and a few other cases, as soon as you go public and do these geoengineering experiments out in the open, you will get pushback. This is also the lesson from Make Sunsets. When they went into Mexico and tried to do it there, they were kicked out by the Mexican government as soon as it became known what they were doing. So on all of these three fronts, adaptation, negative emissions technologies, geoengineering, there seems to be a risk that these large-scale technologies lend themselves to various kinds of authoritarian politics that raises, I think, new problems, new questions around democratic control of climate politics after mitigation, when the dominant classes have basically given up on that pursuit. And really they have, because things are totally out of control on when it comes to fossil fuel expansion and things like this. And let me just very briefly before I end just reflect on something else, which is the relation between state apparatuses and climate activists and climate movements. There's been a trend since, I'm sure you're aware of this, since the pandemic, I would say, of state apparatuses cracking down on the climate movement quite ferociously in the global north. So in 2018 and 19, as you remember, we had this wave of climate activism in the global north, unprecedented. You know, we recall the days of Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion and all this. Then the pandemic happened, and then when the climate movement has tried to continue in various shapes and forms, it has been met with very draconian repression, and there are a lot of things you can read about this report. There was a report published just recently about how climate activists face surveillance and very harsh sentences for very mild misdemeanors or crimes. You know, climate activists in the UK getting 5 years in prison for discussing blocking a highway on a Zoom call and things like this. And there's, I think, a logic to this. So in our books, we use quite a lot of Freudian analysis, so psychoanalysis for trying to grappling with this moment of overshoot. And in this particular case, we're drawing on writings by Tajo Müller, who is, I would say, the preeminent organic intellectual of the climate movement in Germany. And he has argued that in the moment of 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, so from the Paris Agreement to the pandemic, the climate movement in Germany, but I think this applies to other places as well, but Germany really was the country in Europe that had by far the most powerful climate movement in this period. And because governments had formally committed to 1.5 degrees, the climate movement was, during this period, dealt with fairly leniently and even with a kind of courtesy by the police in Germany, because governments had to, so the Angela Merkel government had to kind of acknowledge the climate movement as how shall I put this, as the moral phase of its own nominal commitments, so or the moral voices, spokespersons of what the government itself said that it was going to do. So it couldn't crack down on the movement very harshly. However, this started to change in the current decade, and the logic now, because we're in the overshoot conjuncture, is very different. Climate activists now are, just by showing up on the streets, or even just talking about showing up on the streets, reminding society of its failure to mitigate, and being a source of annoyance just by existing as a movement, virtually regardless of what the movement does. So the level of militancy isn't, it's not because climate activists are militant and do very radical things that society now officially hates the movement. Rather, what Tajo argues is that the movement has to be repressed in both the psychoanalytical and political sense, because in the overshoot conjuncture, it reminds society of how totally it has reneged on its promises and failed to bring things under control. And dominant classes don't want to be reminded of this, and therefore we are moving into what he calls a repressive society. So using the Freudian term, a society of repression, but it's repression in the dual sense, where the climate movement is repressed politically and through policing as a way to push down from consciousness the awareness that we actually failed to mitigate this problem, and we decided to just let things spin out of control. The argument here being that just by moving into the overshoot conjuncture, we're also moving into a more repressive and, in a way, a more irrational relation to the climate movement in particular and climate politics in general. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Andreas. And there are lots of questions.
Thanks both for the talks. I wanted to ask if you could say a bit more about how civil society has maybe helped fill in some of the gaps around the Inflation Reduction Act, with the states doing this kind of industrial policy, maybe for the first time in a long time. You mentioned about what research could do, but what about other kinds of movements, social movements, trade unions, so on? How can they help get this done?
Yes, really appreciate that question. And I guess to back up a little bit too, I think the idea that we've lost the muscle for industrial policy, especially in the US, is partly right. It's also partly wrong because I think there are a lot of industrial planning capabilities, especially in the military and the defense sector. But in more civilian spaces, they are in fact quite atrophied. So one of the things that I've noticed quite specifically is that an institution like the National Economic Council, where in theory planning capability should reside, is very, very minimally staffed. So the kind of research that they would be doing and the kind of planning capacities that they should be doing are either not happening at all, or they are happening kind of in research institutions to some extent. And the example I gave about solar planning is just one effort to try to fill that gap. It's a research gap, and it's also a research gap that's directly related to concrete planning that should be taking place. I alluded to in my talk a little bit to some of the work that civil society is doing around oversight and accountability. There's actually an interesting story there because those of us that first tried to lobby to include labor and equity standards into the IRA and did not succeed, we did succeed in including $25 million for the Office of Management and Budget to do tracking of labor and equity and environmental standards and impact. And that money is not being used for that purpose. So now civil society is trying to kind of take that work and do it themselves. There's a coalition called the Public Investment Accountability Project that's trying to both lobby the White House, and I think probably at some point we'll have to turn to just doing the work directly themselves to do oversight and accountability on a case-by-case, project-by-project basis across the country. But there's also not a lot of philanthropic funding flowing to those activities. So that's a really huge problem. This coalition grew out of the coalition that was fighting for something like a Green New Deal. There's another part of that coalition that's been working more at the state and local level to try to advise and lend a capacity to governments on specific projects. So I think they're trying to help governments access and communities access IRA funding and then work with them to incorporate labor, equity, environmental standards into the projects themselves. I think they probably are a little bit better resourced, but it's also, I think, relative to the resources that are flowing in other directions that are less helpful, still relatively under-resourced. I think there are some initiatives among the labor movement to also come up with new visions for industrial policy. So I'm working right now with some folks at the University of California, Berkeley Labor Center on a kind of a discussion document for the trade unions in California to come up with a vision for an industrial green transition plan in California. And I've heard of similar things happening around the country and actually around the globe. So I think trade unions are definitely starting to get much more into I think recognizing both the need and the opportunity to build their own vision for a green transition and get a bit more specific on the technical details of what that might look like for them.
I have a question to Andreas Malm. I'm really excited about your new books. I'm gonna definitely read it, hoping that there will be some optimistic insights about democracy and so on. But anyway, I'm asking the following question because I think you somewhere mentioned the necessity of utilizing the carbon removal dioxide technologies. Even the left wing needs to do this and so on. But like you talked about carbon capture and storage and geoengineering as the kind of tools for the ruling class in the middle of the overshoot conjuncture. But carbon capture and storage and the geoengineering are totally unprofitable for capitalism. So it must be the state project and state funded, and also it must be the centralized and so on. And it might be regarded as some kind of socialist project that is incompatible with the logic of capitalism. And you somewhere advocated the necessity of ecological Leninism. So maybe this whole thing is regarded as some kind of the realization of your advocation of ecological Leninism. But I mean, what do you think about this possibility?
Okay, shall I answer now?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so this is a very big question. Now, to speaking about Lenin, one phrase that we use in this book is the concrete analysis of concrete technologies. So you need to be very specific and empirical and concrete when approaching these various different technologies. You can't just, you know, brush with one stroke and reject them in a kind of blanket fashion, be against all technologies, or for that matter, being for all technologies. So I think there are different answers depending on what technologies we're talking about. So when it comes to solar geoengineering, I really don't think that there can be a progressive case for that technology. It's fraught with so, you know, such apocalyptic risks and so many problems that I don't really see how you can defend it from a left position. We have comrades who are doing that. I think they're spreading dangerous illusions. But this is, I mean, it's an extensive discussion, and yeah, I mean, we're writing about it over hundreds of pages, so it's very complicated. When it comes to negative emissions technologies, the situation is different. I think we have to admit that we need to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. There's already too much of it. Another question is, what kind of technology can we deploy for that purpose, and how would we do that? And I think that the most promising technology actually is direct air capture, DAC. But there are a lot of problems with how DAC is now being deployed. One being that it's actually not used to draw down CO2 from the atmosphere anywhere except for the Climeworks facilities on Iceland. All other DAC facilities take down the CO2 and then they sell the CO2 as a commodity to various purchasers who use it as an input. So this is carbon capture and utilization. And then it's returned to the atmosphere. It's not actually sequestered under the ground because there is no source of profit from taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and just putting it back under the ground. That is, it's a public good. It's a cleaning up of waste that cannot, by definition, be turned into a commodity or a source of profit, because the whole point of it is to take the CO2 away and put it back under the ground. This argument, it's been developed by others, but this points to the idea that if you're going to actually do carbon dioxide removal, you need to take these technologies out of the market and turn them into publicly financed projects. And of course, there's a question of democracy and state power here too. This applies to, well, you mentioned ecological Leninism. I mean, every kind of actual dealing with the climate problem, including very radical emissions cuts, of course, now comes with a great deal of state intervention into our economies. This has been known for quite some time, but the point with, or something that I wanted to raise here is the kind of next frontier that hasn't so much been discussed yet. What are the consequences for democracy when dominant classes have, in reality, given up on mitigation, and we instead have these new technologies? Now, of course, one argument that we make in the book, which maybe isn't so surprising, is that none of these technologies can actually work without mitigation. So, for instance, if we want to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, the first thing we have to do is to stop putting more CO2 in the atmosphere. Even talking about carbon dioxide removal in this situation can be a distraction, and very often is. It's a little bit like having an oil leak that isn't stemmed and the oil is just pouring out of the tanker. While that is still going on, you're not talking about cleaning up the oil spill. The first thing you do is you stop the leak. Now, the situation now is that no one is stopping the leak. The oil is just continuing to pour. This remains the unfulfilled mission of mitigation. And unless you actually fulfill that mission, carbon dioxide removal is a pointless task. And so is adaptation. And geoengineering, we don't want, and I hope that it will never come to pass. But again, we need to be specific about these different technologies. This is just a very broad brushed answer. There are so many specificities and details that we could discuss, but yeah, I'll leave it there.
There were two questions from before, one here and one in the back, I think.
Oh,
I had a question for you, Isabella. I thought about this question while listening to Clémence earlier, but I think it's still relevant after you talk. It's about the political dynamics behind industrial green industrial policies. I see you work with a few governments in Latin America and also in the US, and the comparison with France might be interesting. Basically, green industry policy is a really pragmatic way to both grow democratic support for climate politics and say take what can be taken within the world of private investors in the industry, subsidize them, and push them to fulfill the promise of a more sustainable industrial system. Basically, what we have is a coalition between the working class, middle class, and some segments of the private investment world. And what happened in France, and I don't want to go into useless controversy, but what happened in France that after the dissolution and the election of the new government, that there was a strong disagreement within the left regarding this kind of strategy. Some part of the left were, I think, ready to create a maybe temporary alliance with the center-right, with Macron, basically, precisely because Macron defined himself as a defender of green industrial policy. But of course, there is a disagreement about the means to achieve that. That's where the split happens. So between the right center, the left, and within the left, between those who were okay to create something like a green majority, and those who said, okay, we cannot go into that precisely because what's important is not the end, the means, budgetary politics, fiscal politics, stuff like that. So is that specifically French? Because I think it is.
Just to clarify.
Do you have
Sorry.
elements of comparison
But just to clarify the distinction between the two camps on the left, the second camp you said is more concerned. Can you just tell a little bit more about the second camp?
Half the French left would agree with, let's say, a governmental coalition based on green industrial policy, even if we know that we would have to fight about the means to achieve that once the coalition is created. And I think that's basically what happened in the US, in the segment between the Green New Deal, Build Back Better, then the IRA. The left of the Democratic Party was in support of this process, critical support, but still support. Okay, and in France, it doesn't work like this. Where let's say the major part of the left, as it currently exists in France, opposed the strategy of the Green Coalition. I think that's a failure, but I understand the reasons why. So.
Yeah, that's what I wondered. So they opposed the coalition because they wanted something different, and that something different was.
They have the same ultimate goal, but they think the difference in terms of means, macroeconomic policy, are more important.
Okay. I'd love to hear.
That's why the coalition is impossible.
Okay. So I don't think I have a full insight into the dynamics between these two camps on the left, but I can talk a little bit about how it's played out here.
Yeah.
So even during the Build Back Better negotiations, it was very difficult to build a coalition, and ultimately, a coalition that I worked with, which had labor, members from labor, from big greens, from environmental justice groups, from smaller greens, democracy groups, economic democracy groups. It was really quite a broad coalition. And toward the end of the Build Back Better negotiations, when the IRA was about to be passed, a lot of those groups actually just left and did not support the final bill, especially the environmental justice groups, because obviously the IRA was going to create the Mountain Valley pipeline and had many technologies that were not embraced by communities that were directly affected by those technologies. So that there was a split there, and those groups, in spite of their opposition to the IRA in the end, are still very active in trying to make the best of the implementation process and kind of how the money's flowing on the ground, and trying to get some of the standards that we didn't get at the statutory level to be included at the local level in some way. Also just a word on the nature of the coalition that we have. And to your point earlier about the role of labor, I think labor has been trying to flex its muscle a little bit because they're very rightly dissatisfied with the fact that most of these policies have not really included labor standards. So for example, all the policies around electric vehicles investments are not covered by the master agreements of the United Auto Workers. And the United Auto Workers therefore withheld their endorsement for Biden. And now the Teamsters are withholding their endorsement for Harris, which is kind of an unusual thing for the labor movement to do, but they're very dissatisfied and have been chronically dissatisfied with the way that the Biden administration has not been able to incorporate labor standards into this set of policies. So you still have support for labor for these things, but it's tenuous and it's eroding, and you have massive growth of support for Trump among the labor movement because he at least has stronger things to say, even
Same
if
in
it's not.
France, but for Trump,
Yeah.
of course, but
I can imagine.
anti-transition side.
And I was gonna say, I think one more thing on that point, but now I forgot, but also happy to talk about this later.
Okay, there was one question from the round before in the very back.
Can you hear me okay?
Louder?
Okay, I had a question for both speakers because there's someone thinking about US policy and someone who I think is in Sweden. But I was curious about kind of the bigger of Scandinavian corporations and like US green industrial policy. I feel like I hear a lot about like Swedish and Norwegian companies and discussions of that, like the Norwegian company building wind power in the Hudson and stuff like that. I was wondering if you guys could talk about that, if there's anything interesting there. And then also there's like these Norwegian companies that are pushing for deep sea mining in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And I was curious about like questions of democracy, these kind of international spaces.
I can say a word about that. I haven't really followed like Scandinavian companies in general, but I think I know you're probably thinking about Ørsted and about SSAB in the steel sector. In the steel sector, like I mentioned earlier in my presentation, there's only, of the $6 billion that the IRA creates for decarbonization of heavy industry, much of that money went to sort of like steel, aluminum, chemical, petrochemical, and other kind of chemical plants that are trying to decarbonize. And of those, the only investment that's actually at the green technological frontier is an investment by SSAB, the Swedish, I think it's actually Swedish-Finnish, but like majority Swedish-owned and state-owned company. So they're the only ones who are actually making an investment that's as green as possible within current technological constraints in the steel sector. And I think it's probably also the case for the heavy industry sector in general. And one of the things that we've been highlighting is that there's a reason why it's a state-owned company that's leading the way in decarbonization. It's because they haven't been quite as subject to the profit motive as private companies, and they've been much more systematic about investing in modernization, which is tied to green transformation. Also, one thing that I forgot to say earlier that's kind of to your point about the role of workers, it's not directly connected, but I think it's worth bringing to light. Since we're not seeing a lot of willingness from private companies in the US to engage in the kind of transformations that we've seen from companies like SSAB in Sweden, one option that I've heard workers talking about is just creating worker-owned companies from scratch. So if Cleveland Cliffs and US Steel don't want to create green steel companies, maybe workers will just create one and then take funding from the state to create one from scratch. Those are very incipient discussions, I think, but at least they're starting to happen. And one more thing about the point of accountability. I don't know if it's Ørsted, I can't remember who it is that's doing deep sea mining. There was a whole thing too with, I think, Ørsted promising to do or taking money potentially to do offshore wind development and then deciding that it wasn't going to be possible. I haven't followed it closely enough to have a comment, but on the point of accountability and oversight, I do think that it's quite dire, the situation. Like there's very little motivation for the state to share the information that's necessary to have accountability and oversight. And they've proven to be very resistant to very well-intended and diplomatic efforts, I think, to get that kind of data, to be able to have civil society play the role of oversight. So that's troubling. And I think it's very tied probably to the political moment and the election, but I don't really see strong indications that it's going to change.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, on the question of Scandinavia, well, Norway is an incredibly nasty country when it comes to oil and gas. It's the largest producer of these fuels in Europe, and there are 5 countries in the global north that account for more than half of all the planned oil and gas expansion until mid-century. These are the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and Norway. So the fossil fuel frenzy that is going on right now is led by settler colonial Anglo-America plus Norway. And there is in Norway a great deal of interest in carbon dioxide removal. And this is being touted as a way of sustaining, making the fossil fuel industry sustainable. This is not a Norwegian monopoly. I mean, you find the same thing in the Gulf, and Saudi Arabia has long promoted the idea that we can have a circular carbon economy, so we can continue to emit CO2, but then we're taking it back down, which means that there are no emissions any longer, so we can just go on forever. As for Sweden is also a very nasty country. It's nastier in a lot of respects than Norway these days, but it doesn't have any fossil fuels. We have companies that are absolutely central to the Norwegian oil and gas sector, but perhaps more interestingly, Sweden is the country that came up with BECCS. So BECCS is a Swedish invention. This is because Sweden, for those of you who've traveled through this country, will know that Sweden is just one big timber plantation. And the timber industry rules most of our actual territory. And for the Swedish timber industry, it was a wonderful idea that you can do BECCS, because that means that you can grow trees and then you can make extra money out of them to use them as biomass, and also as a way to get CO2 out of the atmosphere, so you can start selling credits and offset credits and things like this. And BECCS is now very much promoted, particularly by the public utility in Stockholm called Stockholm Exergi. BECCS and its particular, primarily its ideological role in sanctifying or justifying the idea that we can miss the 1.5 or 2 degree target and then we can go back down. This originates in Sweden. It was Swedish researchers who came up with this idea, and it's rooted in the role played by the forestry business, the timber industry, basically, in Sweden. I mean, Scandinavia is generally not a very interesting part of the world, but it has some nastiness that is of historical importance, yes.
Questions? With you and then behind.
This is a question really for both of you. I have not read Overshoot yet, so some of this might be in it. I'm excited to read it. But part of the thing it seems like has happened in the last couple of years since like 2021 is that this Green New Deal conversation has really become metabolized into a sort of, this is maybe overstating the case, but a national security agenda and logic. You see a lot of the green industrial policy sort of articulated as defense against China. There's, in the US especially, it's a pretty hawkish conversation and there's fights over that. But in terms of these overshoot technologies, and maybe this is different for different ones, but I'm wondering if you see a slightly similar risk. So, having something like solar radiation management used by governments as sort of a tool, a geopolitical tool, incorporated in this sort of geopolitical threat, and slightly separately, but something else that's I think clear in the green industrial policy conversation. It's just that the business case for a lot of these things isn't quite clear yet, and there's US companies who are really struggling to make a profit off electric vehicles, despite all of this sort of effort to protect these legacy industries, pretty, in some ways sort of like on the premise of having a climate goal, in some ways really not, just to sort of like, make sure that US companies can compete globally at some point near off in the future, or just insulate the US market from international competition. But anyway, when it comes to, I guess this is about carbon sequestration in particular, indirect air capture. Is there, some risk in that of there just not being a business case at all? And I think you were getting to this earlier, just the question of like needing a much more sizable role for the state. But, just in the sort of like realm of green industrial policy, from what we've seen so far, at least I'm speaking about the US, maybe versions of this are present in Europe. But just that, the sort of de-risking model that we've been on just doesn't pan out for carbon sequestration, and like what to do about that. Like it seems like there's a really hard business case to be made if we're using this set of tools developed in the IRA and the Green Deal, contracts for difference, whatever, the suite of policies you want to talk about are. But yeah, just the sort of risk, A, of like the overshoot technologies broadly defined being used as geopolitical tools, and B, just like the business case not working out, and what is the like danger of just having the sort of de-risking tools protecting steel and autos and chemicals, et cetera, supplanted onto the carbon management regime.
Yes, you want to go first?
Shall I? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, you're absolutely right about these geopolitical dimensions and articulations of these technologies, geoengineering in particular, again. But when it comes to DAC, yeah, I mean, most of the DAC, the kind of public stimulus for DAC that is happening in the world is in the US. It's within the framework of the IRA with the tax credits for DAC and the DAC hubs. And this, yeah, it's very much framed as a way of supporting and building American industries, but it's also very largely tied to the ongoing fossil fuel frenzy in the US itself, because most of this DAC capacity is geared towards enhanced oil recovery. So the CO2 that is captured is used, it's injected into oil fields to enhance the recovery rate, so to get more oil out of the ground. And the leading case here being Carbon Engineering, the company set up by David Keith that was acquired by Occidental Petroleum, which is the most aggressive promoter of this technology. And the absurdity here, of course, is that a technology that was supposed to reduce CO2, take CO2 out from the atmosphere, is actually being used to take even more oil out of the ground so that even more CO2 can enter the atmosphere. This is how capitalism works. When it comes to geoengineering, the geopolitical dimensions are more salient, just as the kind of anti-democratic or authoritarian tendencies in that technology are. Because the agent that gets to deploy geoengineering will be in control of the Earth's climate. And if there are negative side effects, which there are bound to be, and these have, differential impacts on different countries in the world, it's that agent that gets to decide whether we're going to adjust and modulate in reaction to these negative side effects or not. And I think there are scholars who've made a very convincing case that it's extremely unlikely under any currently conceivable scenarios that the US would allow anyone else than itself or a very close ally, say China or Russia, to be this agent. The US would not accept that Russia became the stratospheric leviathan that has control over rates of sulfate aerosol injection, because these rates might very well damage very concrete American interests. And this is the kind of, geopolitical, or if you like, inter-imperialist field where any actual solar geoengineering deployment would take place. And these scholars, again, have made, I think, a persuasive case that by far the likeliest candidate for an agent that deploys geoengineering is the Pentagon, because sulfate aerosol injection is by definition more or less a military technology. It's going to be undertaken by planes that are a modified version of fighter jets, and the research for this comes out of the military industrial establishment in the US. The role of the state of Israel here might be that of contributing to research in the early stage of technological development. Those of you who have read the book, The Palestine Laboratory by Anthony Lowenstein, will recognize this kind of configuration. But I think it's very unlikely that you would see the state of Israel being the actual deployer who launches geoengineering. It's hard for me to see anyone else than the Pentagon doing this. Yeah, and then it will, of course, be part of the geopolitical conflict that we're looking into in the next couple of decades between the US and Russia and China as the kind of states that might challenge American hegemony.
Just very quickly, thanks for your question, Kate. It's a reminder that I've been very negligent, I think, in my work, thinking about a lot of these overshoot technologies, partly because I find them terrifying and I try to pretend they don't exist, which is not the best strategy. But kind of relatedly, when I do advisory work and work with anyone who's trying to think about how to enter industrial policy and green supply chains, the stance that I've taken is mostly to, when it comes to things like CCS, exclusively focus on the capture of CCS into building materials, which is the only technology that seems to be remotely promising and not terrifying. So that's generally what I try to do, is just like focus on the technologies that we know kind of have passed the precautionary principles smell test. And it's unfortunately something that I don't really see most other people in industrial policy doing. A lot of, I think, hype around many technologies that I think are worth taking a much closer look at. And yeah, I guess I would also kind of frame that as a word of, or as a call for my fellow researchers working on industrial policy things to be a bit more cautious about which things we do and do not accept under the category of green industrial policy.
Okay, well, thank you so much. We are running out of time. So thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Isabel. Thank you all for your great questions. It's been a blast. Enjoy the lunch. Yeah. Okay.